There's a single event in history that made Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 not just possible, but necessary. It wasn't a battle, a royal decree, or an invention. It was the slow death of an ancient network thousands of miles away. Columbus sailed west to find a new route to the riches of the East because the old one, the Silk Road, had become blocked by the Ottoman Empire. For over 1,000 years, that network had been the planet's circulatory system, pumping goods, ideas, and people across continents. The entire age of discovery, the mapping of the globe, the rise of European maritime empires, and the brutal history of colonialism that followed, all of it was a reaction. It was a desperate multi-trillion-dollar search for a workaround after the world's first global highway had been closed. But what if it never existed in the first place? What if that network, that engine of connection, had never been built? This isn't just a story about ancient trade. It's the story of the world we almost had, a world without the Silk Road, and how its absence would have rewritten everything you think you know about history. This is the lore of money. We explore how money shapes history, power, and society. Subscribe for more. Before we explore this alternate world, you need to understand the world the Silk Road actually created. For more than 1,500 years, it wasn't a single road, but a sprawling web of trails, oases, and ports that connected the Roman Empire in the west with Han Dynasty China in the east. It was the planet's first internet, made of silk, spices, and ideas, carried on the backs of camels and the hulls of ships. This network created a contiguous chain of civilization that spanned the Eurasian landmass, turning the vast, desolate landscapes of Central Asia into a vibrant, thriving crossroads of culture and commerce. This is the context that matters, because when we remove this single thread, the entire tapestry of world history unravels. Now let's see what a world without it would have looked like. In our world, the great empires of the classical age knew of each other. They were connected by the long, thin, and profitable thread of the Silk Road. In a world without it, they would have existed in near-total isolation. Han China and the Roman Empire would have been like two separate planets, each developing on its own trajectory, almost mythical to one another. For Han China, the primary strategic reason for pushing westward into the harsh deserts of the Tarim Basin was to secure the trade routes and protect them from nomadic peoples like the Xiongnu. Without those routes, there would be no incentive. The project of extending the Great Wall to protect this commercial corridor would have been far less ambitious. China's powerful economy would have become even more insular, with its foreign trade limited to the maritime routes of Southeast Asia. Its destiny would have remained fixed on its immediate frontiers, a continental giant unaware of its counterpart at the other end of the landmass. For the Roman Empire, the consequences would be just as profound. Rome had a voracious appetite for Chinese silk, a luxury so desired that it caused a massive and controversial drain of gold and silver from the imperial treasury. Without the Silk Road, this economic drain would stop. However, the Roman economy would also be far less dynamic. The state would lose the immense tax revenue it collected from customs duties on these luxury imports. Rome's geopolitical focus would remain locked entirely within the Mediterranean basin and its European borders. The powerful Persian empires to its east would be seen only as military rivals, not as the difficult but essential middlemen for the world's most valuable goods. This isolation would have been devastating for those middle empires. The immense wealth of the Parthian and Kushan empires was built almost entirely on their strategic position, controlling the flow of goods and taxing the caravans. Without that transcontinental trade, they would have been reduced to minor regional powers, their economies based on local farming, making them far less formidable to their neighbors. The entire balance of power in Asia would shift. The great cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, would be ghosts. These legendary oasis cities owed their very existence to the constant stream of caravans that needed places to rest, trade, and resupply. Without the Silk Road, they never would have developed into the cosmopolitan centers of learning and commerce they became. They would have remained small, isolated settlements, their populations limited by the unforgiving desert environment. Central Asia would not have been a vibrant crossroads, but a vast, empty buffer zone separating the great civilizations. The world's economic center of gravity would have shifted dramatically. The dominant axis of interaction would no longer be east-west across Eurasia. Instead, it would be north-south. The maritime spice routes of the Indian Ocean connecting Africa, Arabia, India, and Indonesia would have become the world's undisputed superhighway of trade. Global wealth and power would concentrate in great port cities like Calicut in India or Aden in Arabia. At the same time, the trans-Saharan trade routes, exchanging West African gold for Saharan salt, would have become even more critical to the Mediterranean economy. The empires that controlled these north-south routes, the maritime Islamic caliphates and the gold-rich Sahelian empires, would have become the dominant global powers for a much longer period. Europe and China, located at the far, disconnected ends of these networks, would have seen their relative importance on the world stage shrink dramatically. The absence of the Silk Road would create deep, unbridgeable technological chasms between civilizations. Key inventions would remain localized for centuries, slowing the pace of global change and fundamentally altering the outcome of history's greatest revolutions. The Silk Road was the primary conduit for a suite of transformative Chinese technologies that remade the West: papermaking, printing, gunpowder, and the compass. Without it, China's genius remains trapped within its borders. Consider paper. The secret of papermaking reached the Islamic world after the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, when Chinese prisoners of war shared their knowledge. Without this overland contact, that knowledge transfer might have been delayed for 500 years. The Islamic world and Europe would have continued to rely on expensive and scarce materials like parchment and papyrus. This would severely limit the spread of literacy, the size of bureaucracies, and the preservation of knowledge itself. The European printing revolution of the 15th century, the very engine of the Renaissance and the Reformation, would have been impossible without an abundant, affordable medium like paper. Johannes Gutenberg's press would have been an invention without a purpose, a solution without a problem. But the most consequential contained technology would have been gunpowder. It arrived in Europe in the 13th century, where the continent's constant state of warfare created a hyper-competitive environment that spurred rapid and deadly innovation. Without its transmission from China, European warfare would have continued to be dominated by armored knights and stone castles for centuries longer. The Gunpowder Revolution, which allowed new centralized monarchies to shatter the power of feudal lords by knocking down their castle walls, would never happen on schedule. This would have fundamentally altered the political development of Europe, delaying the rise of modern nation-states. The magnetic compass, another Chinese invention, would have eventually reached the West via the sea, but its delayed arrival would have further hampered an already delayed age of discovery. This was not a one-way street. The Silk Road also carried technologies and ideas eastward. China received knowledge of grape cultivation and winemaking, advanced glassmaking techniques from the Roman world, and new metallurgical skills. The exchange of crops diversified agriculture and improved diets at both ends of Eurasia. Without this exchange, both civilizations would be poorer. The European Renaissance itself was fueled by two things the Silk Road provided: incredible wealth and forgotten knowledge. The immense profits from the Eastern trade funded the artistic and scientific flourishing of Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa. At the same time, the rediscovery of classical Greek texts, many of which had been preserved and translated by scholars in the Islamic world, was facilitated by these same networks of exchange. Without the wealth from trade and the intellectual contact with the Islamic world, the Renaissance would likely have been a much more limited, localized event, or perhaps delayed by centuries. While China would have retained its technological lead for a much longer period, this isolation could have led to its own form of stagnation. History shows that it was the competitive environment of Europe that spurred rapid innovation in the application of technologies like gunpowder. In a world of technological isolation, China might have lacked the external pressures that drive development, leading to a long but fragile supremacy, followed by a shocking decline when global contact was finally made. The Silk Road was more than a conduit for goods. It was a melting pot for culture and religion. Its absence would result in a world of more isolated, monolithic civilizations, where the ideas that shaped billions of lives would have remained confined to their homelands. The most significant example is Buddhism. The Silk Road was the primary vehicle for Mahayana Buddhism's journey from India into Central Asia, and then into China, Korea, and Japan. This was a transformative event that profoundly shaped the art, philosophy, and culture of all of East Asia. Without the overland routes, Buddhism's spread would have been almost entirely maritime. It would have reached the port cities of southern China, but it likely would have remained a minor religion of foreign merchants, never achieving the deep inland penetration and state-level patronage it historically received. A China that never had to grapple with a major foreign religion might have become far more culturally rigid. The introduction of Buddhism provided a powerful alternative to the state-centric ideology of Confucianism, introducing new concepts of individual salvation and universal philosophy. This created a dynamic tension that spurred centuries of intellectual debate. Without that challenge, Confucianism might have calcified into an even more rigid and unchallenged orthodoxy, making China less adaptable to outside ideas when broader global contact was eventually forced upon it. The same would be true for other faiths. Religions like Nestorian Christianity and Manichaeism, often persecuted in the West, found refuge and new converts in the cosmopolitan cities of the Silk Road. Without this eastward escape route, they would have likely faded into obscurity much earlier. The spread of Islam would also have been reoriented. While its initial expansion was driven by military conquest, its long-term peaceful diffusion relied on trade networks. Without the overland Silk Road, Islam's eastward expansion would have been blunted at the Persian frontier, with its influence primarily spreading south into the Indian Ocean and west across the Sahara into Africa. Central Asia's historical identity is defined by its role as a crossroads. Without the Silk Road, it is not a crossroads, but a void, a great emptiness separating civilizations. This means that when these cultures finally did meet, it would be a sudden and violent collision. Without the centuries of gradual interaction and cultural translation that had softened the edges between them. The most profound and terrifying impact of the Silk Road's absence would be biological. It would reshape the very demography of the planet, averting one of history's greatest catastrophes, while paradoxically locking a continent in a state of arrested development. The Black Death, which raged from 1346 to 1351, was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, killing up to 200 million people. The historical and scientific consensus is that the plague originated in Central Asia and spread westward along the Silk Road trade routes, carried by infected fleas on rodents traveling in merchant caravans. In a world without the Silk Road, this is the single greatest point of divergence. The Black Death would have remained a localized epidemic on the steppes. It never becomes a pan-Eurasian pandemic. Europe is spared. The consequences of averting this catastrophe are staggering. Europe's population, which was devastated by a plague that killed up to 60% of its people, would have continued its steady growth. But this survival comes at a steep price. The massive death toll of the historical Black Death created a severe labor shortage. This dramatically shifted the balance of power from landowners to the surviving peasantry. Wages skyrocketed, and the entire feudal system of serfdom was fatally weakened. The plague was a brutal but effective catalyst for the social and economic transformations that ended the Middle Ages in Europe. Without it, the feudal system would have likely persisted for centuries longer. Serfdom would remain economically viable, peasant wages would not rise, and the social mobility that accelerated after the plague would be stunted. The authority of the Church, which was severely questioned during the plague's onslaught, would remain much more secure. Without this single biological event, the entire transition towards early capitalism and the cultural flourishing of the Renaissance is either aborted or radically altered. A world without the Silk Road might very well be a world where Europe remains locked in a medieval socio-economic structure for centuries longer. This biological isolation would also mean that when global contact is finally made, perhaps in the 17th or 18th century, the populations of Eurasia would be completely naive to each other's diseases. The first pandemic to sweep the newly connected world could be even more devastating than the historical Black Death. And so we return to Columbus. In a world without the Silk Road, the entire European age of discovery is delayed by 1 or 2 centuries. The initial motivation is gone. Without centuries of established trade, the riches of the East would be a vague rumor, not a well-established economic reality that could justify massive state investment in risky voyages. Furthermore, without the Ottoman Empire blocking a vital, pre-existing trade network, the immediate pressure to fund expeditions like those of Columbus or Vasco da Gama would be vastly reduced. The discovery of the Americas, the direct sea route to India, the rise of the Atlantic economy, and the subsequent horrors of the slave trade are all pushed back into a different, unrecognizable future. Even the Mongol Empire's impact is changed. The Mongols would still have conquered Eurasia, but the resulting Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, would have been an enforced peace over a far less economically integrated territory. Without the profitable Silk Road network to administer and tax, the Mongol Empire would lack a key source of revenue and a coherent economic logic beyond tribute. It might have fragmented even faster, and the transcontinental journeys of figures like Marco Polo would have been impossible. The world we know was built on a foundation of connection, and the Silk Road was its first and most important layer. The story of the Silk Road's absence reveals a profound truth. It doesn't just reroute trade, it rewrites the development of civilization itself. Without it, China remains an insular giant, technologically advanced but stagnant. Europe stays a feudal society, spared the Black Death, but also denied the catalyst that forced it into the modern age. The Islamic world's focus shifts to the sea and the desert, and Central Asia becomes a great void. The lesson of the Silk Road isn't just about silk or spices. It's about the incredible world-shaping power of a network. Globalization was not inevitable. It was a specific historical project, started by empires thousands of years ago, that created the first draft of a connected world. That network was a fragile creation. The modern world that would eventually emerge from this alternate timeline would be unrecognizable, shaped by different powers, divergent technologies, and starkly different cultures. The names change. The methods evolve from camel caravans to fiber-optic cables. But the core mechanism of history stays the same. Connection is the engine of change, and isolation is the architect of stagnation. The patterns that shaped the ancient world are still running today, and the connections we build or break will define the future. If this opened your eyes to how a single network can build a world, subscribe. Because the patterns that shaped history are still running today. And I'll show you where to look.